The Suitland Murders, a suburban nightmare. Suitland, Maryland. A quiet suburb just outside Washington, D.C., the kind of place where families settle down, where kids ride their bikes on tree-lined streets, where neighbors greet each other in passing. But in the late 1980s, something sinister lurked in the shadows. Women were disappearing. Their bodies, when found, told a story of terror, brutality, and a killer who operated undetected. This is the story of the Suitland Murders, a case that shook the community, baffled investigators, and to this day remains unsolved. The first body, it started in October 1986, a crisp autumn morning. A man walking his dog along Suitland Parkway, a wooded stretch often used as a dumping ground for trash and abandoned cars. But that day, what he found was something far worse. Woman's body, partially clothed, her hands bound, her throat slashed. She had been there for days. The police arrived quickly. Officers from Prince George's County fanned out across the scene, marking evidence, taking photographs. One detective, a veteran with over 20 years on the force, took one look at the brutality of the crime and muttered under his breath, "This is just the beginning." He was right. A pattern emerges over the next year. More bodies appeared. Always in wooded areas, always women, always brutalized. The similarities were undeniable. Police knew they had a serial predator on their hands. Victims were young, African American women, many struggling with poverty, some involved in drugs or sex work. The kind of victims society often ignored. One officer, speaking off the record years later, admitted, "Had these women been from wealthier backgrounds, this case would have been treated differently." But back in 1986, the case was far from ignored. Detectives worked around the clock, piecing together forensic evidence, interviewing witnesses, and following every lead. The investigation begins. The Prince George's County Police Department formed a special task force, 25 officers dedicated solely to catching this killer. They combed through autopsy reports, studied crime scenes, looked for connections. A few key things stood out. The killer wasn't just dumping bodies. He was choosing locations carefully, places where discovery wouldn't be immediate, but also not impossible. He wanted the bodies to be found. The level of violence suggested deep anger. Some wounds were post-mortem, overkill. A witness near one crime scene reported seeing a dark sedan idling nearby, engine running. A man inside, cigarette smoke curling from the driver's side window. Who was he? A witness? A suspect? No one knew. Then, in early 1987, a breakthrough, or what seemed like one. A suspect in Sight Alton Alonzo Best, a convicted rapist, violent, unpredictable, and freshly released from prison. Police were already watching him for another murder in Washington, D.C., but the timing lined up. The murders in Suitland stopped after his arrest. Coincidence? Or proof? Detectives were convinced they had their man, but there was a problem. No physical evidence tied Best to the Suitland murders. No DNA, no fingerprints, nothing concrete. One detective later said, "In our guts, we knew." But knowing isn't proving. Without proof, the case stalled. Fear takes hold by now. The murders had made the news. Women in Suitland were terrified. They stopped going out alone. They locked their doors early. Some even left town altogether. SARS. Community wanted action. And when the police couldn't provide immediate results, another group stepped in, the Guardian Angels. The Guardian Angels were a volunteer crime prevention group, unarmed but vigilant. They patrolled the streets in red berets and white t-shirts, determined to make their presence known. Some officers appreciated the extra eyes on the streets, others resented them. One retired cop later reflected, "They meant well, but it felt like they were saying we couldn't do our jobs." Regardless, the murders had stopped. But the case? Far from solved. Dead ends and false leads. Over the next few years, detectives chased down every possible lead. They interviewed former inmates who had done time with Best. They cross-checked cold cases in neighboring states. They even consulted FBI profilers, hoping for insight into the mind of a killer. Nothing. Best, despite his violent past, never confessed. And without a confession, without evidence, the case remained frustratingly out of reach. By the early 1990s, with no new bodies appearing, the Suitland murders case went cold. The family's pain for the victims' families, time did not heal. 1. Mother years later spoke at a press conference. They say justice is blind, but sometimes I think it's just looking the other way. Each anniversary of their daughter's deaths brought renewed grief, renewed calls for answers, but the answers never came. Where it stands today, decades have passed. DNA technology has advanced. Cases once thought unsolvable are now being cracked open. Could that happen here? Prince George's County Police say the case is still open. But with each passing year, the chances of solving it grow slimmer. And yet, some detectives refuse to give up hope. One, now retired, still keeps a file on his desk. I made a promise to these families. If I ever get the chance to close this case, I will. For now, the Suitland murders remain a dark chapter in Maryland's history, a chilling reminder that some killers walk free, and that justice for some never comes. Call to action. If you have any information about the Suitland murders, contact the Prince George's County Police Department. Even the smallest detail could help bring justice to the victims and closure to their families.